start to take questions. If I could just put a few things in perspective. There's been an awful lot in the news, you may have heard in the bike press, certainly of late, both over the situation with driver licensing, with the new test we've got in the UK, which was, of course, came out of some European legislation. And now the anti-tampering legislation, type approval and market surveillance regulation, which is causing us all sorts of issues as regards wanting to tune our bikes, wanting to replace air filters, choose tyre sizes, that sort of thing. Now, that piece of legislation, as we currently stand, passed its first stage of the legislative process on the 5th of December with some amendments. And alas, some of those amendments are even more frightening than the original proposal. And I hope that during the day today we'll highlight what some of those are. But Peter here is not a transport specialist by any means, but he is prepared to come along and meet, because this is how anybody learns, this is how anybody lobbies. We all work together so that he can hear constituents' complaints, really, or concerns. And I believe it's the level of correspondence you've received already that effectively thought, well, why don't we just meet everyone in one go, because there's so many letters to answer. Peter's specialisms are finance and economy, but we'll not let that get in the way of today. And although I know there's going to be some direct questions about certain issues and some just sort of discussion around things, I think if you don't mind, because there are quite a lot of people here today, if you can't hear, do come forward. There's loads of space at the front, no one's going to bite you. But what I think I'll do is, if I can take sort of 3 questions at a time to get things off the deck, so Peter can address those, and we'll just see how things go from there. So, do you want to do a brief intro, please, before we do anything?
Thanks, Paddy. And thanks very much. Happy New Year, everybody, and thank you very much for coming here. I'm Peter Skinner, I'm an MEP. I've been elected since 1994, and first time round I got elected, it was for a constituency, and then subsequently now for a region. So the entire region of the southeast of England, which is about 8.5 million people. That's an awful lot of motorcyclists, if you think of that. A lot of people whose concerns have flooded in over the recent months and over recent weeks about the issue of this proposal and about what we can do about it. And I think that fundamentally, behind many people's minds is what is Europe doing meddling in our business? I'd like it to be phrased the other way, is what can we do to change what's happening at an international level, at a European level, particularly led perhaps by the industry lobby, who see an opportunity perhaps, or indeed by people who think in their minds that they're helping distinctly to reduce accidents around the European Union, who aren't taking into account the proportionality of the effects that this legislation and parts of this legislation may have, or indeed the reduction in freedom and whether or not that really balances out with the real effects of what this law should be about. It shouldn't be about taking away basic freedoms. I had a long discussion with Paddy, you won't be surprised to hear that, and I've also read a lot of the concerns with the missives who have come into my office. I have been talking to my colleagues in the very committee where this vote took place, and I intend from this day to go and speak to the very chairman of that committee, who's a friend of mine, although he's a conservative. I don't hold things against people politically for personal reasons, and I'm going to put it to him that actually, as someone who knows something about the motor manufacturing business, as he does, he should be listening entirely to this side, because the balance has been entirely on the other side for far too long. And secondly, I rather think that if there hasn't been a very good study which has been promoting this, and I believe that the Commission, the European Commission, is held and bound by procedure to hold a study to see what the effects would likely be in a cost-benefit analysis on the implications across Europe. If they haven't done that properly, then there is reason to hold back the final vote on this legislation to see whether or not we should wait to see what that study says, because that could affect the final outcome. It's a bit like the tail of a horse needing the cart, and I think it shouldn't be that way around. Now, it's true, I should be listening to your concerns and speaking less about myself, but I think, you know, a couple of the issues that have been brought to my attention, ABS systems, for example, is something which, for me, in terms of what I've been told, is an easier one to reconcile in the minds of many MEPs because of the power-weight ratio of bikes, and particularly about the CCC issue on many of those bikes. I hear from inside the machinery of Brussels that the Italians, the French and the Spanish are now getting very agitated and are very angry about what they see come out of the Council and what's finally been voted in the committee. So I'm hopeful I'll be able to also speak to many of my colleagues in those groups and actually remind them of their weight of opinion in those countries. And if you have any contacts in those countries, you have friends and emails, I'm sure you have, across the European Union, contact them, reach out to them, make sure that they know that they should be talking to their MEPs as well before March, before this final deadline comes down, so that they too can say something about it. It's not just motorcycles, it's motorcycles per se, it's scooters, it's mopeds, it's the Peugeot bike CC arrangements. It's all of those things. We have many cousins, nephews, you know, lots of people in our family who we should be reaching out to, and it shouldn't be distinctly about just the British position. That, unfortunately, sometimes works against us. You can see that happen. What we want to do is make sure we're leading something which is a European change. And if we can get that, and get it at a European level, every citizen of the European Union will benefit from that. And wherever you go inside the European Union, you equally will be able to benefit from that. So I'm a representative, not of Brussels, here in the southeast, and a southeast representative in Brussels. It's not a matter of Europe poking its nose in Britain. I'm your nose to poke in Brussels. It's up to you to arm me with the facts, statistics, and information so I can go back and start to raise as much as I can in terms of influence and to calm people's fears. Thank you.
Good. So, I presume there are a few people chomping at the bit. Any particular issues? Shout them at me and I'll quickly jot them down.
Could I ask that somebody actually sets the scene as to why we're actually going forward with this legislation? You know, what, you know, we all are probably aware of these parts of it, ABS, day glow equipment, that sort of thing. But why are we here talking about it in the first place?
For me, it's because I don't want a piece of legislation which I believe is ill-conceived to pass. And we're in this real odd scenario where we have some, really for no other reason than I think dogma. Once a piece of legislation has been ill-drafted and it enters the system, it's like, well, this is going to have to pass. We have to pass this, and somebody thought this was a good idea, so we must do it, having never conferred with any of the user groups or the industry.
Go back a step though. Why is the legislation even being considered?
Because motorcyclists won't stop dying. It's the bottom line. And it is a concern. Now, what's interesting is that the bulk of riders who do die in an urban area on a very small machine. And so much of the legislation which is being proposed is for big machines and got nothing to do with being within a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. So there's a serious mismatch there in what a perceived problem is and the perceived attitude of dealing with it. And we don't believe that all riders should be penalised for something that could be attended to a different way.
Can I answer it in another way as well? The question asks, why are we talking about legislation at all in this field? Well, partly because the bikes, as you can see around here, are not British manufactured alone. They're obviously manufactured from all parts of the European Union around the world. And quite often, I mean, this is why the European Union came to existence in the first place, was to create a market which could actually benefit from internal economies of scale by getting things that were almost exactly the same as could be sold, fitted in many other countries. So there's a good reason for it in the background. And the legislation was technical much of the time, up until a point. Now, of course, we're marrying safety implications with technical legislation. That safety implication, as Paddy's indicated, may have been oversold or sold in a way which has actually been misleading in order to be able to present further detailed technical legislation, which may not be necessary, and there hasn't been a proper study of that. And that's why the Commission should really be charged with the responsibility of taking the legislation to one side until they've had such a study and looked at the implications of that. So you're right in one way. Why have we got the legislation which is ill-fitting when we should have had something in the first place that said that it was suitable for its purpose? If it was about reducing road deaths, shouldn't it surely have been about licensing arrangements for other road users and motorcyclists, for example? Shouldn't it be about car users or pedestrians walking out in front of bikes, whatever? But shouldn't it have been something about that? And you'll be pleased, I hope to know, that we've been campaigning on the side as well to make other arrangements for tests complicit with that particular arrangement, to try to find ways in which other road users would be aware of how motorcyclists use the road, which they frankly are completely unaware about. So those are the things, because if you think about it, technology in itself will never reduce all the fatalities on the road. It's road use itself. It's how selfish some people are, how ignorant some people are, and frankly how stupid and reckless some people are. But to assume that people are reckless just because they use motorcycles is wrong. So fundamentally, what they seem to be plugging into this is an idea that the technology can take over from the recklessness. And that's not true. So we need to go back to the very basis of this and challenge the Commission on the very foundations of why they're laying this legislation down. So I hope that helps to explain something.
Certainly. Is it the case that the statistics for motorcycle accidents and deaths are totally different to cars that are being modified by young drivers that have umpteen modifications on them? Are those deaths, have they been looked into, and is there a corresponding set of statistics? So are we being singled out on our cars being able to be modified? Is there anything, any proposals that will also apply all this type of legislation to cars and modifications?
I'm unaware, and I don't know across the whole of Europe, what the specific rules are, but we have a police officer in the back there who might be more able and willing to tell us about modifications, I think, but I won't point you out anymore. There's a couple of things. First of all, I believe you will still be able to modify machines, but I think within category, up to a point, which is allowed. And I think that's very important that we maintain that. Outside of the category, then I think it's a different matter, and that's what you more or less regard as common sense anyway. And on cars, I'm not an expert here.
They tried to bring it in 25 years ago with cars, and all clubs in the UK got together and stamped on it.
Really?
Yeah.
We do have a situation where what the motorcycle industry generally is catching up on the car industry in all things. And they are actually further ahead of us in type approval already. And we're all chasing what is called now, you'll be delighted to hear, the global technical standard, automotive technical standards. And that's part of what this legislation is also aiming towards, trying to make things absolutely standard everywhere. The manufacturers, of course, love the idea that they will only ever build one model of bike which they can sell in every country in the world. If I can just jump, and I know I'm not supposed to be here talking today, and I'll shut up in a minute, and I'll sit in the corner and cough, but there aren't specific stats that I'm aware of. But what you'll find that the definite correlation always is that those modified cars, the bulk of them where people are dying, it's actually the same social demographic. So it doesn't really matter about the modification. It's still a young lad between the ages of 17 and 22, stuffed full of testosterone, all his mates, and generally a few beers. And that, alas, is whether it's in a bike or a car or anything at all, that is something that needs to be addressed. But there aren't, as far as I'm aware, stats specifically broken down. There certainly aren't in bikes to say, well, the bike was modified or not in accident situations. Sorry, I don't know that. But I'm sorry, I'm not.
Can I just add something to that? I have access to some of those stats, and modifications, whether it's bikes or cars, has little or no significance on the fatality rate. It's down to the human element.
Why has the insurance industry preempted any action by the EU as well, and they've already said that more than 3 modifications they won't insure a bike? That's Bennett.
Really? Okay. That's information to me.
Excuse me, could you repeat the question? We can't hear from there.
Why has the insurance industry already predicted the outcome of this legislation and said that more than 3 modifications to a bike makes it uninsurable? Basically, I think that was the question. And I responded by saying I didn't know that. And that is information, and maybe it's something to take up with the ABI actually, and ask them why. Sorry?
Say one company.
There's only one company?
At the moment, it's a very large company, though. It's the biggest insurer in the UK.
I think we ought to keep an eye on it, frankly, because competition within the insurance industries can be pretty cutthroat, and immediately they start turning people away for less costs as they see it, then it makes it all the worse for competition. So I'd be pleased to hear some more about that, and on the financial services side, maybe we can speak to the ABI about that as well. Association of British Insurers.
Mr. Gentleman, back you. While you're talking to the ABI, can you point out to them that very, very few of the insurers recognise any advanced private training at all? Now, the guy makes the point about haven't the insurers actually started to influence what happens within the market? Well, they're already influencing. They're not recognising advanced riding qualifications at all.
That surprises me. It makes it a disincentive to actually take on any advanced training, which if the insurance companies don't recognise any work that you do personally in terms of demonstrating your skill, then how can they know that you're a safe provider? It seems contradictory to me. Will, thank you very much.
Could I bring in Steve at this point?
They do have, we've had, what you've got to look at is motorcycle training really, we've only had a professional body. We've only had a professional body in the motorcycle training industry for not quite 20 years yet. And the biggest issue we've had with DSA, DFT, is there is no one register that assures that everybody that is teaching advanced post-license is actually at a standard where it's safe for them to do it and to deliver that training. For the last 3 years, DSA, DFT, motorcycle industry have been working with the MAG on the Enhanced Rider Scheme. That's going another level this year with the Learning to Ride, Learning to Drive programme to ensure that all instructors, bike, car, HGV, PSV, meet minimum standards. Once we can start to achieve that, then we can say, okay, you've been and done your training with somebody that's actually qualified and approved. Now we can start looking at more serious insurance discount. With the ERS at the moment, I believe most insurance companies that are on the list will give you up to 15–16%, but only upon renewal. For myself, my insurance is only £140 a year. So if somebody gives me another £10, I'm only going to save myself £14. So the insurance discount on advanced riding qualification alone isn't really that much of an incentive. A lot of it comes back to what Paddy says, is the social side of things. We need to actually make sure that people are stopping. Riding irresponsibly must be seen as a bad thing for all of us. We all love going out and having fun, but you've got to say you've got to do it in a safe environment. So, hope that
So,
my understanding of this legislation is that there's a procedure that's supposed to be followed with the required amount of research and information fed into it. That the Ombudsman has actually investigated this, and in this case that procedure's not been undertaken, and yet it's been allowed to move to the next phase. I don't understand how they can move legislation through the European government without following their own procedures.
I know we have somebody who actually managed the challenge to the Ombudsman in the audience, so perhaps he'd come forward. But I will answer the question as honestly as I can. I think it's irresponsible of the Commission to move ahead without such studies. I think that if politicians have also backed the Commission by writing amendments in this respect, I'd like to know why. I will be speaking to the committee chairman on Monday of this week, and I believe that actually if the Ombudsman has laid down a claim that it's maladministration or malfeasance or whatever, then as he is allowed to investigate the institutions of the European Union, then that's a pretty heavy hand to avoid. So I don't know, where are we with this?
John? Yeah. Hi. My name's John Strong. Sorry, I took up the case with I was the person who took up the case with the Ombudsman. Current state of play is he said there's a case to answer. He hasn't made an adjudication. I have to get to a point by 31st of January where I've responded to him. The Commission's process for responding has been to give very vague references which I've had to pursue down to at least 2 layers of internet search, etc., to make sure that they're actually referring to correct data. And my own analysis is that if I go down that deep, then the evidence is at best ambiguous and quite often points the other way, away from their argument. So at the moment it's still an open case. The one thing that we have had that's positive was that as part of the PTI work that's coming along, I raised...
Periodic technical inspection or the
MOT. I raised the complaint that actually it was an anti-democratic survey because it was only available in English. And that excluded people, for instance, in northeastern Italy who are bilingual in German and Italian for historic reasons, and said this isn't fair. And in another case on a tax issue, the Ombudsman has come back and said no, the Commission must run all surveys in the major European languages. So that one's I'm 1 point up out of 6. So
Is it the impact study? An impact study and survey?
that was a PTA, that was a survey that would be feeding their impact assessment for the MOT. They've done an impact assessment for the type approval regulations, and I went through that with a fine-tooth comb, and my belief is that it doesn't actually comply with the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. And I've put quite a detailed case together. I wouldn't bother printing it off if you go to the Ombudsman's site. Download it if you want, but bear in mind that most of the 270 pages are actually gaps of information that the Commission should have, in my view, in place. So where's this? Where's that?
In essence, yeah, there are some technicalities. Alas, we are in a situation where we do have to chase really, really fine, stupid details in some points. Some would say real pedantry, but it's because we have to use every possible angle we can to try and stop some of this stuff, or at least to get them to listen to us as a user group and say, if you're going to pass all this bike legislation, you've got to talk to riders. So that's an issue. However, another thing you did mention and allude to, for those of you who don't know, when the committee stage vote happened on the 5th of December, there was still an impact assessment ongoing. So they voted before they had the results for an impact assessment on what they were being asked to vote on, which really must be some kind of major faux pas in legislative procedure. But sorry, Peter. Fire. Questions?
How many voted on this?
So there's 756 MEPs, there's 45 MEPs who probably can vote in this committee. This committee is the Internal Market Committee. It deals with and it has several competences which will then devote time to. So if it's told that it has the technical competence to be able to do things and there's no legal problem to it, which there seems to be, then they will have been told that they can go ahead and vote on it. That will be down to the committee chairman then, either to have instructed it, to have asked questions as to why he can or cannot proceed with that particular vote. So if, for example, it was actually fundamental to this legislation, as I believe it is, that an impact assessment was first arrived at before the Commission came up with a proposal, it may have then given the scope and room for the committee chair to have said, well, hang on a moment, there's some glaring errors here, we've got to do something about this. But impact assessments should come before anyone puts a pen to paper. Impact assessments coming along even at the time of legislation being considered aren't good enough in reality. We've always said that if you want to make good law, you've got to start with the basis of why you want to write that law. You've got to explain how and why you want it. Going back to the elements of subsidiarity, what we mean by that is how much you would allow for local governments, i.e. member states, UK, Germany, France, to determine how they would apply that law to their own citizens. And that level of subsidiarity up until now has been quite flexible. We've always enjoyed the relationship which has allowed the UK to be sometimes at the forefront of technical change and safety requirements. Sometimes other countries have lagged behind, we know that. But the reality is when a committee votes, before a parliamentary vote, it is a precursor for the law coming in. So the danger is, when we get to what they call the plenary, when they get to the legislative vote in the Parliament for 756 MEPs, if that passes, then that goes straight on to the Council for approval and then becomes a law. And then it goes into the official journal, and then all bikes produced after 2016 would have to conform with
14, 16, 17, depending on the element within this regulation. There are certain parts that will come in earlier than other parts.
Right.
So how many and who actually voted on this?
I have no information I can give you as directly as that, but I think maybe somebody who's gathered that information would know. 45 MEPs.
38 were there on the day.
38.
If this legislation goes ahead without proper consultation and reports, what on earth can we do as a group to stop it? It just seems to me that not only amongst the EU, but amongst local councils, it's very difficult as a motorcycle. I'm a member of MAG, I know there are other organisations that fight for this, but we're almost like a persecuted minority. I'm going with this bus lane, you can go in that bus lane, and it's very difficult as an individual, although I'm very happy with the way that MAG represents our views in Europe, to actually feel that we're doing anything. And this is just a typical example where there is a certain procedure to be had, which is just, it's not proceeding in the correct way.
Yeah. I mean,
And we have great frustration with Europe in that sense. We, as it's not just that we're little islands or anything. It's just that it just seems to be the whole situation seems to be totally ridiculous sometimes.
It should be. Europe should be allowed to move apace with all the right studies and impact assessments. I mean, the UK actually led on demanding for impact assessments for quite a long time. We got them in terms of the framework for all EU law to be written. It can't really be ignored. What we can do, and would you say that it's too late? I never say it's too late. Before a vote is finally taken, it's never too late. We've already seen some modifications occur inside the committee, some which may have gone one way, some which may have gone the other. I think what we have to sit down is talk to consumer groups like MAG and say, look, here's a voting list. These are the amendments we don't like. These are the amendments we do like. These are the ones which we think you should be following. And if we can't get that, this is what we think you should do at the end of the vote. Or indeed, maybe at the beginning, you should be postponing the vote, moving it to a point where we're able to get access to our democratic rights to review much of the information which is coming from this particular impact assessment. And let's say we don't know what's in this impact assessment, good or bad. So we have to be worried that actually the information they're using, as we've just heard, might not be the information which is the fullest or the most useful for the side of the argument which we stand on, or you stand on. So don't give up. That's why I'm here today.
We have the perfect example with the subsidiarity, whatever you call it, where the DSA took the rules with regarding to training, biker training, and completely and utterly, after, everybody said this system will not work, building all these, centres, having this particular two-stage test, not allowing the training organisations to take part of that, and we end up with a huge cock-up with regards to the new motorcycle test. It's been a real downer on the industry. Few people have taken their test.
I might be able to agree with that, but I don't know enough about it.
We just seem so frustrated that whatever we do, whatever organisations, people above us seem to say, well, we don't care, we're doing it that way, we don't care.
Just before I bring in the gentleman at the back who says hand up for a moment. Sorry. If I could say about that, I mean, yes, it's not over till the fat lady sings, as they say. I would like to point out that as small an organisation as we are, and alas, we're barely 2-3% of the motorcycling community, and we could be much bigger if all motorcyclists decided to help write to MPs and MEPs and make this stuff aware. But I would like to point out that even as small as we are and with our meagre resources, it's not very often that a committee stage vote is postponed 5 times. This should have all been done and dusted in February. It's been quite amazing how vociferous the battle has been to get it as far as it has, and to get so many, even the 38 who did vote, to actually, read and consider all those amendments. And the number of MEPs, like Peter now, who, when it comes to plenary session, plenary is a fancy word for the whole Parliament stuck together, doing an actual full parliamentary vote, which alas only happens roughly 6 days in every month. So it is always a limited time, and this is
real theatre.
Well, it is because, if I may speak possibly out of turn, if you've got 3,000 pieces of legislation for the plenary session to sort of pass in a year, and they meet 6 days in every month, there's often not an awful lot of time other than to say yeah or no. And you can't read all those pieces of legislation. So hence the committees, the idea of the structure as it currently stands is that the committee specialises in it and sort of leads on whatever the subject is, in this case transport, and then sort of advises the Parliament. Our concern is that the advice they're about to give the Parliament is bollocks, if I can be so brutal.
We must also divide the myths, and if you like, I have to say, sometimes what we see is also just the pure anti-European rhetoric, what we can do to change things. Because we have to be realistic, and we have to demonstrate that actually this community is sensible, responsible, has a plan of action, and sees the benefits of having some legislation, but proportionate legislation, which they know that would be sensible on the ground. And if that argument is the one that's heard the best in Europe, that's the one we have to proceed with. It's not no, no, no. It's yes, maybe, only if. And you prove it.
Who was over here with a hand up? Please.
I'm curious, if they don't get these impact assessments done in advance of the vote, how can that then become law? I mean, is there some redress at that point if it goes through to theoretically becoming law if they haven't followed their own due diligence?
Well, the proposition is, has the Commission followed its due diligence, not Parliament? And that's the problem, really. So Parliament won't be seen to be outside of doing its normal procedure, but the Commission has. And that's why the Ombudsman was asked to consider whether or not the Commission had proceeded when the initial legislation was proposed. The problem is, and we're going to get bound up in technical legal procedures, when really we should all be getting down to whether or not we want to